Good morning, it's Airtalk. I'm Larry Mantle. Coming up later this hour, the huge success of the Marvel superhero film Black Panther. KPCC Film Week critic Tim Coggs shall be with us to talk about particularly the film's significance with African American moviegoers. We're also going to talk about the Los Angeles legacy of Billy Graham, how the evangelical Christian movement became so deeply rooted in Southern California, and what big role Billy Graham played in that with his multiple LA crusades. But first, we begin with the future of cash bail in California. And there is a major state appellate court case that's brought the bail system into sharper focus. This involves the case of a defendant who'd had bail set at $350,000. 64-year-old Kenneth Humphrey was charged with stealing a $5 bottle of cologne and other associated charges. He had been held since last May because of his inability to make bail. So the state Court of Appeals determined that the bail that was set was excessive, and that this is potentially a problem here in California where many people can't afford to pay their bail. State Attorney General Javier Becerra announced earlier this week that he will not appeal that state appellate court decision. This, along with legislation in Sacramento, appears to be paving the way for the state to move away from cash bail and instead using other algorithms and judges' decisions over who can be released on one's own recognizance and who should be held in lieu of bail. With us, public defender for the city and county of San Francisco, Jeff Adachi. Mr. Adachi, good to have you with us.
Hi, Larry. Thanks for having me on your show.
So are we coming to the final nail in the coffin for cash bail or not yet?
I think so, but the question is, what is bail reform going to look like? I mean, if you talk to judges, legislators, community, everyone has a different idea. Now, the significant thing about the Humphrey case is that the Court of Appeal, which is the second highest court right under the California Supreme Court, said that money bail is a tax on the poor. And it recognized the basic contradiction in our system, which is supposed to be about liberty and justice for all, is that you buy your freedom. If you're charged with murder, it doesn't matter whether or not you're a public safety danger or not. If you have $1 million or $100,000 to put up, you are out on the street. If you, on the other hand, are charged with a low-level felony or even a misdemeanor case and you can't afford to put $1,000 up, you're going to be behind bars. And in this country, we have over 700,000 people who are being held behind bars simply because they cannot make bail. And that's something that needs to change. And I think that everyone is united in talking about bail reform, but everybody has a different idea of what that legislation would look like. And so there is a bill, it's called SB 10, and it's going to be making its way through the legislature this year. But the Humphrey case is significant because it says that the law of the land requires that judges not arbitrarily set bail, which is what they've been doing for years and years and years.
Well, and if it shouldn't be a judge's decision, is this all going to go to some sort of algorithm that determines whether someone's a flight risk or not?
I think the suggestion is to move to something like what they do in federal court. There they have a pretrial release agency that does a comprehensive investigation of an individual and presents that information to a judge with a recommendation. And the key thing is that they look at least restrictive alternatives. For example, if you could release somebody on electronic monitoring or use another means of supervision to ensure that they'll come back to court, that is what should be done as opposed to just routinely setting money bail. In California, the judges unilaterally set what's called a bail schedule. So if you were charged with an offense, Larry, they would say, okay, Larry's charged with offense X or Y. The bail is $100,000, and so that's what it is without really considering your individual circumstances. And so what the Humphrey case said is that judges, you're doing this wrong. The way that you're setting bail is unconstitutional and illegal, and you have to start doing it right. And so it's going to require a change in the law, but at the same time, judges have to stop setting bail in the present practice immediately.
I assume, though, that the federal court that you mentioned, they're dealing with a much lower percentage of people accused of violent crime than you find in state superior courts. So this would seem to have a higher degree of risk where people involved with violent crimes.
Right. And I think that everyone recognizes if you're charged with an extremely violent crime, then there is a means to keep a person into custody. It's called preventative detention. And there, under the state constitution, the prosecutor has to prove by clear and convincing evidence that you are a public safety risk. The problem is that you have judges now who are simply keeping everybody in because they're afraid that, they're going to commit a new crime if released, and therefore, we're going to set a high bail to keep people in jail. And the court has said you cannot do that, that is unconstitutional and that's illegal, and that has to change. Because in San Francisco, like for Mr. Humphrey, he had really no recent record. His bail was originally set at $650,000, which is an incredulous amount. And then after the Court of Appeal said to the judge that bail's too high, the bail then was reduced to $350,000, and now they've sent it back again. So this idea that you're using bails in order to keep people in jail is not constitutional.
We're talking with Jeff Adachi, the public defender for the County of San Francisco. Also with us, Vice President of the Association of L.A. Deputy District Attorneys. He is a Deputy DA himself, Eric Siddall. Mr. Siddall, good to have you with us again.
Good morning.
So what are your concerns about moving to an alternative form of determining someone's risk when they're released on their own recognizance?
Look, if we could move to a complete federal system where we didn't have bail, we would be fine with that. If there was some type of risk assessment that was that determined whether a person would remain in custody or not. Our state constitution actually gives a right to bail. So when Mr. Adachi talks about the federal system, he also fails to mention that that detention in the federal system is about 59%. Here in Los Angeles County, detention rates hover around 24% for those eligible for bail. So actually, the federal system has a higher detention rate than we do here in Los Angeles County. But I think that the one thing that we all agree on is that low-level offenders who do not pose a flight risk, who do not pose a public safety risk, should be released. That actually is what happens under the current system. There's a presumption of being released on your own recognizance if it's a misdemeanor. In other words, it's a minor offense. And that's pretty much what's happening right now. The problem we have with the whole bail reform movement is that there's a lot of misinformation that's happening. First of all, there's this bogus number being sent by the proponents of Senate Bill 10, which Mr. Adachi referenced. That says that detention rates here in the state of California are about 66%. That's simply false. If you look at the numbers here in Los Angeles County, I've looked at numbers in San Diego, and also the Judicial Council's own information. I don't see one county that's above 66% of those who are eligible for bail.
And you said L.A. County is 24%?
It's about 24, 25% and I'm talking about who's actually eligible for bail. In other words, they're not there for a probation hold or any other type of hold. They're there simply for a new case that they're eligible for bail. So, while we would like to see a more robust system like the federal system, first of all, it's a lot more expensive. Second of all, it doesn't really go with our Constitution because our state Constitution is more restrictive than the federal Constitution.
What do you think about the court using Humphrey as sort of an example of bail gone wrong, $350,000 for what's portrayed as the theft of cologne?
Okay. Well, if you were to listen to Mr. Adachi's renditions of the facts and also his op-ed in the Los Angeles Times, you would have thought that this was a petty theft case. Well, Mr. Humphrey was actually a fourth striker. His minimum sentence, even if the judge struck all the strikes, would have been 17 years. 5 years for 3 5-year priors, plus 2 years, which is the minimum for robbery. That's 17 years. Further, this was not some guy who was just stealing cologne. He went in, attacked a 79-year-old vulnerable victim who was using a walker, kicked his walker, simply not the facts that Mr. Adachi is trying to portray of this particular victim and defendant.
So do you think that Humphrey posed a potential threat if he was released on his own recognizance?
Well, here's the great joke about the Humphrey case is that in San Francisco right now, they use a bail tool that looks at risk assessments. It's an algorithm. Mr. Adachi has actually been against this algorithm in San Francisco. The algorithm actually said that Mr. Humphrey should be detained.
Because of his priors.
Because of his priors and because, well, the algorithm is more of a mathematical algorithm. It looks at many other factors, but it said he should be detained. So according to SB 10, they would use the same type of algorithm within every county. So even if we had something like SB 10, you would see Mr. Humphrey most likely remain in detention.
Now, on the one hand, you say, he hasn't had offenses in recent years. He's 64 years old. What kind of a threat at that age does he pose? On the other hand, you're raising the issue because he was, I think you said this would be a 4-time offense. Do you think he was a flight risk because he was potentially exposed to a long sentence?
Actually, he was a fifth time offender.
Alleged in this case, yeah.
Well, the other 4 were proven, so that's not alleged.
But so is it your contention that even though he's 64 years old, that there's a flight risk because of the earlier offenses that he wouldn't want to expose himself to the 17-year sentence?
Well, 17, remember, is the absolute minimum if he were to be found guilty of the robbery. If he was actually sentenced according to the 3-strike law and no strikes were stricken, he would have been looking at 40 to life. So we're talking about a substantial sentence that he was facing. So is he a flight risk? Yes. And is he a public safety risk? Yes. I think someone who targets a 79-year-old in their own bedroom and attacks them and says, I'm going to, basically kill you with a pillow, I think that guy is a public safety risk.
So he threatened to smother the other man. Is that in the allegation?
That's actually in the preliminary hearing. That is something that, again, Mr. Adachi failed to mention, but is actually in the preliminary hearing that was before the judge, who found that there was probable cause to have the charges go forward.
So, Mr. Adachi, public defender of San Francisco, the claim by Mr. Siddall that the $350,000 really isn't out of line in this case.
Well, it's interesting to listen to Siddall. I've, debated him before on these issues, and he seems to be saying 2 different things. He seems to say, we're fine with bail reform, and we're fine with moving towards a system, that doesn't rely on subjective decisions by judges. And then he goes through this litany of facts, which I think illustrate how these cases, in many cases like this, are overcharged. I mean, what happened here is that there was an argument that occurred in an apartment. This is something that involved Mr. Humphrey and another individual. Mr. Humphrey, 65 years old. There are alleged threats that were made. There's a $5 cologne bottle that was taken allegedly by Mr. Humphrey, and this thing is then charged as a residential robbery case. And then the judge then proceeds to stack all of the charges. Stacking means that they'll charge you a separate bail for each and every charge. Now, this is endemic of what happens in the criminal justice system, particularly of people of color. What Mr. Siddall doesn't mention is that there's been a number of studies that shows that higher bails are set for African Americans, that they're charged with more serious offenses and more offenses.
Is Mr. Humphrey African American?
Yes.
Okay.
And this is endemic of our system. And so when you're talking about, giving judges the exclusive power to make the decisions, we know from every objective study that's been done, we have 2 that's been done in San Francisco, that we have a discriminatory system. Why is it in the whole world there are only 2 countries, the United States and the Philippines, that has a money-for-profit bail system? Why is that? If we're so enlightened and the current system's working so well, then why is it? Why is Kentucky, Indiana, Maryland, all of these other states reforming their bail systems?
Right.
California is behind the ball. And one of the problems is that the district attorneys and the district attorney associations are not getting behind bail reform, and they need to. If they care about justice, they need to change their attitude towards bail reform.
I want to thank you for being with us, Mr. Adachi, the public defender for the County of San Francisco, joining us. Eric Siddall, L.A. County Deputy District Attorney. He's the Vice President of the Association of L.A. Deputy DAs. Thank you for being with us. Coming up, we're going to talk with Film Week critic Tim Cogshell about the powerhouse box office debut of Black Panther. Obviously, the film appealed to a wide range of audience, not simply African-American viewers, but arguably it had an even more significant impact than just an entertainment for many African-American viewers. We'll talk about that, and we'll take your calls. I'd like to hear your thoughts about Black Panther and the experience of sitting in that Afrocentric universe of that film. 866-893-KPCC or the Airtalk page, kpcc.org. Back in 1 minute.